am not, nor ever have been, any other person but me. I am not trying to lead people to believe or make them believe that I'm somebody that I'm not. If anybody says so, they're wrong.
The room had grown still. Every eye turned toward the pulpit as Pastor Bob Joyce, his voice heavier than usual, took a long pause. Then came the words that froze his congregation and rippled outward into the world. I'm dying, and before I go, I need to tell you the truth about Elvis. For decades, rumors had swirled around him. Some said Bob Joyce was simply a preacher with a remarkable gift for music. Others insisted he was much more. The king himself, alive, hidden in plain sight, having traded rhinestones for robes. Theories multiplied online, fueled by uncanny resemblances and a voice that carried the unmistakable warmth and gravity of Elvis Presley. But Bob had always deflected, always denied, insisting that he was just a servant of God. Until now. The way he framed his words that day was unlike anything before. This wasn't a casual dismissal or a patient correction. This was a man staring down his own mortality, ready to unburden himself before time ran out. His voice, usually steady, trembled with an edge of urgency. His followers leaned forward, caught between disbelief and anticipation. Was this the moment the decades of speculation would finally be answered? For years, Bob Joyce had been the unwilling epicenter of a storm he never asked for. Videos of him singing spread across the internet, racking up millions of views, each one dissected by fans convinced they were listening to Elvis himself. The shape of his jaw, the timbre of his voice, even the cadence of his speech, all fed into the fire of conspiracy. And no matter how many times he said otherwise, the movement only grew stronger. But on this day, with the weight of finality in his tone, something shifted. He spoke of the burden of carrying secrets, of the pain of being misunderstood, of the strangeness of becoming a symbol in other people's stories. He didn't call names or point fingers. Instead, he spoke like a man preparing to lift a veil that had been in place for far too long. He reminded his listeners of what Elvis represented, not just music, not just charisma, but the embodiment of an era of broken dreams and impossible fame, of triumphs mixed with deep wounds. He spoke of how the world clung to Elvis, refusing to let him go, spinning theories and legends because the truth that a man so vibrant could die so young was too bitter to swallow. Then his words turned more personal. He admitted that the speculation had haunted him for years, following him into his ministry, creeping into every performance, every sermon, every encounter with strangers who looked into his eyes and saw someone else. He confessed that he understood why they believed, why they wanted to believe, and how, in a way, he had become the vessel for their hope. The congregation sat in silence, some with tears forming, others holding their breath. They were hearing not just a pastor, but a man at the end of his journey, finally speaking plainly. His voice cracked as he said, "Before I leave this world, I need you to know the truth about Elvis. Because his story, whether you believe he still walks among us or not, holds a lesson greater than any rumor." What made the moment so powerful wasn't simply the content of his words, but the weight behind them. This was no longer about internet theories or fan debates. This was about mortality, about legacy, about a man who understood that his final chance to speak could not be wasted. And while some waited for a direct admission, for him to say outright that he was Elvis Presley returned from the dead, what they got was something more complex, more haunting. He began to weave a story of faith and fame, of identity and illusion, of how legends never really die because people refuse to let them. His words suggested that the truth about Elvis was not about whether he was alive or dead, but about what he represented to millions who still felt his presence decades later. Still, the phrasing lingered. "I'm dying, and I need to tell you the truth about Elvis." It wasn't a denial. It wasn't an affirmation. It was a confession that opened more doors than it closed, leaving the congregation shaken and the world buzzing with speculation. Did he finally mean to confirm what so many believed, that the king had never really left? Or was he delivering a deeper message, one that blurred the line between myth and man? One thing was certain. The silence that followed was unlike anything his church had ever experienced. His listeners were left stunned, caught between awe and confusion. For years, they had wondered if Bob Joyce's resemblance to Elvis was coincidence or destiny. And now, with his own mortality pressing in, Pastor Bob had shattered the calm with words that demanded to be remembered. Because whether or not he intended it, his confession set the stage for something bigger than rumor. It was the moment that transformed a quiet pastor into the keeper of a mystery too powerful to ignore. And what he revealed next would not only shake his congregation, it would ripple outward into every corner of the world where Elvis Presley's name still carries the weight of a king. The whispers didn't begin with Pastor Bob Joyce. They began the very day Elvis Presley was declared dead, August 16, 1977. For many, the announcement didn't feel final. It didn't feel believable. Elvis had been so larger than life that the idea of him lying still, gone forever, was almost impossible to accept. That disbelief became the soil in which rumors took root, and decades later, Bob Joyce would become the lightning rod for all of them. The first cracks appeared at the funeral. Those who viewed the body swore it didn't look like Elvis at all. Some described the skin as waxy, like a mannequin. Others said the features were off, the nose too straight, the hands too smooth. Whispers spread that the body was a wax figure, hastily prepared to fool the public. The inconsistencies in official documents only added fuel. Elvis's death certificate listed his middle name as Aaron, even though he had long since adopted the biblical spelling Aaron. To believers, this wasn't a mistake, it was a signal. Then came the sightings. Weeks after the funeral, reports emerged of Elvis boarding a plane in Memphis under the name John Burroughs, the very alias he had used for years while traveling incognito. Others claimed to see him in airports, diners, or quietly walking down streets where no one expected him. Each story might have been dismissed on its own, but together they formed a chorus too loud to ignore. As the years passed, the legend of Elvis' lives became more than a tabloid fantasy. Books were written, documentaries produced, entire fan communities built around the possibility that the king had faked his death to escape the suffocating prison of fame. They argued that Elvis, exhausted by the spotlight, addicted to pills, and crushed under Colonel Parker's control, had orchestrated his own disappearance. To them, his death was not an ending, it was freedom. And then decades later, the name Bob Joyce began to appear in those same circles. Videos surfaced of a pastor leading worship in Arkansas, his voice booming with power and tenderness. The first reactions were almost disbelief. "That's Elvis," people said. "It has to be." The way he sang, the way he held notes, the unmistakable tone, it all felt too perfect to be coincidence. Side-by-side comparisons with Elvis's gospel recordings spread across the internet, and for many there was no question. The resemblance didn't end with his voice. Fans began analyzing photographs pointing out the same jawline, the same eyes, the same expressions. They measured his height, his frame, his mannerisms. Some claimed the way he moved, even the way he smiled, was identical to Elvis. Within months, the theory exploded. Pastor Bob Joyce wasn't just a preacher, he was Elvis Presley, alive and hiding in plain sight. The more Pastor Bob denied it, the more the rumor grew. His refusals were clear. "I am not Elvis Presley. I am Bob Joyce." But believers dissected every word, searching for hidden meanings. They argued that, of course, he would deny it. If Elvis wanted to remain hidden, if he had chosen a life of ministry over music, then denying the truth was the only way to protect it. Testimonies from fans only deepened the mystery. Some swore that attending Pastor Bob's services felt like stepping back in time, as if Elvis himself had walked onto the stage. They spoke of chills, tears, the undeniable sense that the King's voice had returned. Videos of Bob Joyce singing "The Wonder of You" or "Amazing Grace" circulated with captions declaring, "Elvis lives." And so the rumor refused to die. It grew with every note he sang, every video uploaded, every fan who swore they had seen the truth with their own eyes. Bob Joyce became the center of a global fascination not because he asked for it, but because he embodied the possibility that Elvis had escaped the fate no one wanted to accept. For skeptics, it was all fantasy, grief clinging to a dream. But for believers, it was more than a dream. It was a second chance. A chance to imagine that the king had survived, had chosen faith over fame, had found peace at last. And when Pastor Bob finally spoke of his own mortality, the rumor took on a new urgency. If he really was Elvis Presley, then time was running out to hear the truth from his own lips. But what he revealed when he finally addressed it left his followers stunned. Not because it gave answers, but because it deepened the mystery even more. To understand why the theory surrounding Pastor Bob Joyce refuses to die, you have to look closely at the man himself. For years, while the world speculated and debated, Bob carried on quietly in Benton, Arkansas, serving his congregation with humility. His focus was on preaching the gospel, leading worship, and offering counsel to those who came to him broken. And yet, even in his refusal to embrace the spotlight, he became one of the most discussed figures on the internet. People who attended his services often described an overwhelming presence. His sermons were heartfelt, his delivery powerful, his music stirring. But what stood out most was the resonance of his voice. Deep, soulful, instantly recognizable. It struck listeners like an echo from another time. To some, it wasn't just a talented pastor singing hymns, it was the king himself, his voice aged but unmistakable, singing not for fame, but for faith. But Pastor Bob was not a man of spectacle. He lived a life of simplicity. No glitter, no limelight, no grand tours. Just Sunday mornings in a small church, quiet evenings with his Bible, and a deep commitment to the people he shepherded. For skeptics, this was proof enough. He wasn't Elvis. He was exactly who he said he was. But for believers, it was the perfect disguise. After all, who would expect the most famous man in history to live out his final years hidden in plain sight, behind a pulpit in Arkansas? Bob himself has addressed the rumors more than once. He has denied them directly, saying, "I am not Elvis Presley. I am Pastor Bob Joyce." His words are clear, yet his delivery is never mocking, never dismissive. Instead, he speaks with compassion, as if he understands why people can't let go of the belief. To some, that kindness is further proof. They argue that if he were truly just another pastor, he would laugh off the idea. But Bob never laughs. He denies with calmness, but he denies in a way that still leaves room for mystery. Psychologists who study these theories say that part of the reason the speculation sticks is because of the man Bob Joyce has chosen to be. His message centers on redemption, transformation, and rebirth. He preaches about leaving behind an old life to embrace a new one. He talks about second chances, about finding peace when the world has taken everything else away. For his congregation, it is the message of a pastor. For believers in the Elvis theory, it is the hidden testimony of a man who once lived at the center of chaos and chose to step away. Priscilla Presley and Lisa Marie both dismissed the claims while they were alive, insisting Elvis had truly passed. But their words did little to silence the believers. If anything, they argued it proved the family was protecting a secret. Of course, they would deny it, some said. They're guarding his choice to live in peace. This contradiction, the pastor's denials versus the world's obsession, created a tension that has never gone away. On one side stands Bob Joyce, a man who insists his only identity is rooted in faith. On the other stands millions of people who believe his very existence is the greatest secret of the last century. And then came his recent words about dying. For those who had clung to the theory for years, it felt like a moment of reckoning. If he really was Elvis, this might be his last chance to tell the truth. If he wasn't, then why choose such a dramatic way to address the rumors? Either way, it placed Bob at the center of a storm he never sought but could no longer avoid. For his followers in Benton, he will always be their pastor first. For Elvis's fans, he may forever be the king in hiding. And for Bob himself, caught between denials and belief, he remains a man defined as much by what people want him to be as by what he truly is. But one thing became clear as his health declined. Whether or not Bob Joyce was Elvis Presley, the words he chose in those final sermons carried a weight that felt like history itself. And as he spoke of truth, of mortality, of the legacy left behind, it became obvious that his final words would matter. Not just to his congregation, but to everyone still searching for the man behind the myth. When Pastor Bob Joyce finally spoke of dying, the air in the room changed. His words carried the weight of someone who knew time was running short, someone who wanted to leave nothing unfinished. For years, he had lived with the shadow of another man cast over his life, with rumors that clung to him no matter how many times he denied them. And now, with his voice heavy but resolute, he gave what felt like his final word, not just about himself, but about Elvis Presley. He didn't begin with denial or confession. Instead, he began with truth, the kind that outlives rumor, the kind that lingers long after a man's voice fades. What matters, he said, is not who I am, but what we take from the story of Elvis. A story of fame, of brokenness, of a man searching for peace in a world that gave him none. It was a startling way to answer the question. For decades, fans demanded certainty. Was Bob Joyce secretly Elvis, or wasn't he? Yet here he was, sidestepping absolutes and pointing to something deeper. He acknowledged the pain of Elvis's life, the brilliance of his gift, and the tragedy of his decline. And then he tied it to his own message, the gospel he had preached for years, that redemption is always possible, even for the most broken soul. To some, this sounded like a confession in disguise. They heard the quiver in his voice, the choice of words that seemed too personal, too weighted with memory. To others, it was simply a pastor using the myth that surrounded him as a vessel for truth. Either way, his words struck like lightning. He spoke of mortality, of the way fame blinds us to the humanity of the people we idolize. Elvis was the king to millions, but to those who knew him best, he was a man drowning in pressure, craving normalcy, longing for freedom. The truth about Elvis, Pastor Bob said, is that he was human. And because he was human, his story matters more than any legend. He lingered on the idea that people never wanted to let Elvis go, that the conspiracy theories, the sightings, the comparisons weren't just about doubt, they were about grief. Fans couldn't bear to accept that someone so vibrant could be taken so suddenly, so they clung to the possibility that he lived on, disguised but still singing, still reaching them in unexpected ways. Bob acknowledged that he had become part of that story, willingly or not. His voice, his appearance, his very existence. These things gave people hope, stirred memories, reopened wounds. And though he denied being Elvis, he admitted he understood why people wanted it to be true. Because the world didn't just lose a star in 1977, it lost a piece of its heart. What Pastor Bob offered in that moment was not an admission, but a legacy. He called on his listeners to take Elvis's life as both inspiration and warning. Inspiration, because his music touched the world and continues to move souls decades later. Warning, because fame without peace is a curse that consumes everything in its path. Elvis was brilliant, but he was also fragile. He gave everything, but in the end, it cost him everything. And then Bob turned his words back to faith. If you want the truth about Elvis, he said softly, it's this. He was searching for rest, for meaning, for grace. And whether you believe he found it before he left this world, or whether you believe he lived on, the question isn't about him, it's about you. Will you find it? The silence that followed was absolute. His congregation wasn't just hearing about Elvis anymore, they were hearing about themselves, about mortality, about the fragile line between legacy and loss. When he finally closed, he left the question open. He didn't confirm, he didn't deny. He gave something more haunting, a message that Elvis's truth lives not in conspiracy, but in the lessons we carry forward. Whether Bob Joyce was Elvis Presley or not ceased to matter. What mattered was the echo of his words, the weight of his final truth, and the way it reframed the king's story, not as a myth, but as a mirror. For those who wanted certainty, it was unsatisfying. For those who wanted meaning, it was unforgettable. And as Pastor Bob's health declined, his final word became not the end of the rumor, but the beginning of something larger, a story of faith, mortality, and legacy that will outlive both him and Elvis Presley. Pastor Bob Joyce's final words didn't end the debate, they deepened it. Was he protecting a secret or giving the world a greater truth about Elvis and about ourselves? Do you believe his silence was confession or conviction? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more untold stories that challenge the legends.